Hi everyone, welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, game masters, enthusiasts, boatmen, and air sailors alike. I am Dan, of course, with me is Josh, as always.
Hi everybody.
And on today's podcast, we'll be discussing...
Today's podcast, which is 53, unlike the tail end of last episode, which you said was the 53rd. This one is 53.
It's only because I did like 2 half episodes in the middle, so I smushed them together and I miscounted. So that's my
It's
fault.
all good. It's all good. But that's in case, you know, we probably got emails in between them saying, hey, did I miss an episode? You said that was 53, but it's numbered 52, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that was like how I have said in the past that my brain contains multiple versions of stuff. Because Dan did a couple of interlude Legends episodes.
Yeah. My counting was
off. He didn't look at the number beforehand.
No. My counting was off, but you know, in exploding dice, 52 is just as good as 53 if you're hitting something. I'm kidding.
Usually.
By that point,
if it's not, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah. If I'm going for a horror, if a 52 doesn't hit it and a 53 does, I deserve to die. So that's all there is to it. No, today we're going to talk about all things nautical, because a while ago we brought up the whole airboats or airships and riverboats are an important part of the setting for Earthdawn. They make it stand out more so than most other fantasy games. So these are characters or things you can throw in almost as their own little NPCs into your campaign. So we're going to go talk about certain types of. The first half of the episode is going to be all riverboats. The second half is going to be all airships, and Josh is going to fill us in mostly on how to incorporate them in your game and how prevalent a role they should possibly play, unless I'm missing the point.
No.
Toss on.
Yeah, one of the things that has kind of floated in terms of 4th edition development is updated rules for airships and riverboats. There have been systems... Show. Yeah, we're not going to get into that aspect of the mechanics at all, but I did kind of want to talk about this up front with regards to airships and riverboats and the systems, you know, that originally it was planned that the airship and riverboat stuff was going to be part of the companion.
Yeah.
And it got cut for space reasons, among other things, but it was primarily space, but also because I've never been particularly happy with the system that had been developed previously for airships and riverboats. I mean, it's okay, but my biggest issue with regards to the airship and riverboat combat rules is that it's like a Decker in Shadowrun, which is to say that when you get to that aspect of things, it often sidelines the other player characters, is that they're kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs while the air sailor or sky raiders or whatever are kind of doing their thing.
Hogging the spotlight.
Yeah, and I'm not, you know, until you get to the point where you are actually doing a boarding action and the player characters can then actually get back involved, back down to the PC scale. You've got different time scales. Like in theory, the airships and riverboats operate like on a 1 minute round, whereas the they take their turns every minute, which is like 6 traditional combat rounds. And so you need to like switch back and forth between them. But if the ships aren't close enough, then there's not really a whole lot of anything that can happen, you know, during those regular. Again, there's some fiddly stuff there. The system is fine, but from a gameplay standpoint, there's not a lot for player characters to do. And one of my biggest design goals for airship and riverboat rules is to find ways to involve all of the players, not necessarily involving their characters, but to find things for each player to do to maybe perhaps operate the airship as a group.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's stuff that, you know, there's there is a design goal there to try and minimize there's basically two directions you can go with them. One is the super simple way where you are largely just going to be using the airship or riverboat as a mobile location. And the other is to go like crunchy, tactical sort of thing where you're getting out of the player character scale and into sort of the next scale up, but you need to find ways to get all of the players involved in that, because at that point you're sort of like getting into a tactical minis game. And if your players don't have anything that they can do during that, then they could lose interest, and that's not good, not being engaged, whatever. Again, the decker problem. If the decker is off doing their thing that the other players can't interact with, then, we're going to go get a pizza or watch a movie while you resolve this hacking run. And I want to avoid that sort of thing when it comes to airships and riverboats. And I've got some ideas on ways to approach that. The easiest way is to just basically handle it narratively when you're talking about the airship and riverboat scale of things, is to just deal with it narratively and, maybe have some use, for example, if you look at the blog post that I had online about chase rules, some of which were incorporated into the Legends of one of the Legends of Barsaive adventures, how you can sort of rig that up to kind of deal with an airship or riverboat pursuit. But that's that sort of thing is coming up with a system that, and I don't even know if it's actually possible to do everything that I want to do in terms of those sorts of rules. So we will maybe have some test versions of that if we get a document actually written up and whatnot. But anyway, I think I'm rambling at this point.
No, you're fine. I was writing something down for a point to make later on in the airships part, but that was just me. So I was trying to remember something, had to go look it up. You gave me the perfect opportunity to do so. So in the meantime, let's go over some basic riverboat design, because again, they've not been touched on in the 4th edition, haven't been updated in quite a while for any edition really. So the riverboat types, we're going to start small and kind of go big. And I think only really the last couple of examples are powered paddle boats.
Right.
Because
setting-wise, the Tiskrang riverboats kind of loom pretty large in the imagery associated with the Tiskrang especially, but the Serpent River and waterborne travel in general in Barsaive because of the Serpent River network and whatnot. But there are, if you go back and look at earlier editions, there are stats provided for more traditional boats as opposed to the powered paddle wheel contraptions of the Tiskrang.
Yeah. So,
but the riverboats are like the big thing because they're kind of special and associated with one of the coolest races in fantasy gaming.
Yes, and the houses of the Tiskrang work with them, and so that's a major character. So let's start a little smaller and go with this. We'll just start with the first 3. You got a canoe, 1 to 8 human passengers, a rowboat, 1 to 5 human passengers, and a sailboat, 2 to 5 human passengers. The canoe, maybe you don't want to do on an open sea.
Yeah.
Not that there's a lot of open seas. But the rowboat, the sailboat, how would you work those in for characters to use?
Well, I mean, at that point, you're looking at these are water vessels that people are familiar with. Like, even if you might not necessarily have used one yourself, what a canoe or a rowboat or a sailboat looks like, and at least to some degree how it operates and the scales of them. I mean, you've got the small, like 2 or 3 person canoes that I'm very familiar with, that we use on lakes and stuff and rivers up here in the northeast of the US, all the way up to, you mentioned that some of them can have as many as 8 or more.
Yeah, 8's a big canoe.
8 is a big canoe. At that point, you're potentially looking at like the outrigger canoes associated with the Polynesians and things like that. So you certainly could have a vessel of that size. Rowboats are similar. They tend to not get quite as big as canoes because of the efficiency of rowing vessels as opposed to paddled vessels.
Oh, yeah.
And then sailboats, which use the wind. And those can, you can have those getting all the way up to larger sort of sailed yacht kind of things. Not necessarily quite up to the clipper ships and other vessels of, at that point where you're looking at multi-mast sailing vessels.
Yeah.
But the sailboats that they're talking about here are more the traditional single mast, maybe a single mast with a jib or something like that. I actually know some stuff about sailing and whatnot.
That's the thing.
So.
You do. I live in a landlocked state, and I'm also hydrophobic. I'm afraid of water. I don't know how to swim. I will drown. I sink like a stone. I am a cinnamon in real life. So I looked at all these and said, this is cool to know. But how would I work those? So me being as I am, how would you work in a canoe or a rowboat or a sailboat into an adventure of some kind?
Well, I mean, basically at any point, if you're looking at any kind of adventure where you are going to need to either get across or travel along a waterway, especially if you're looking at ones that are some of the tributaries of the Serpent River, rivers in the Servos jungle, especially the Servos network and the various other, there's like 2 or 3 rivers that pass, tributaries of the Serpent that pass through the Servos jungle.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a couple of other rivers and things like that. Anytime that your group is going to be, that the adventuring group would potentially be dealing with water obstacles, rivers, lakes, anything like that, they're going to need some way to traverse it.
Yeah.
Bridges aren't really a thing when you're out in the wilderness. You don't have the massive engineering capabilities that we do, where you can build bridges that span the Hudson or the Mississippi or the Colorado River or anything along those lines. Even in quote unquote modern day, a lot of times larger bodies of water, larger rivers were a real legitimate obstacle, and that crossing them would require waterborne craft of some sort, whether those were canoes or barges or anything along those lines. Yeah. So if you've got an adventuring group that is going to be traveling in an area where they are likely to encounter that, they may want to, they may want to, canoes, you absolutely, one of the advantages of canoes is to a certain extent, their portability.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I know certainly it is possible for you probably don't want to be carrying any other gear while you're doing it, but it is possible for one individual to portage to carry a small, we're talking like the sort of traditional 2-person, 3-person canoes, the staves across the middle part of it that kind of span between the gunnels, which are the sides of the canoe.
Look at you getting all technical.
Oh, yeah. Like, if you look at a picture of a canoe, you'll often see that center staff, that center spanning rail will often have like kind of a circular part. Like, rather than just going straight across, it kind of goes across, then does this kind of arch out and then finishes. Mm-hmm. That's actually designed so that when you put it up, that is resting. Like, your neck goes into that circular part so that the stabs are resting right on your shoulders.
Because you don't carry it by dragging it. You carry it over.
No, you generally don't want to carry it by dragging it.
No, you carry
because dragging it
on your shoulders.
Yeah, you carry it, on your shoulders, kind of like a backpack in a way. And, one part of it is kind of extending a little bit above your head out forward, and then the other part of it is behind you.
Yeah, but you don't want to carry it by dragging it, to your point.
You don't want to carry it by dragging it, because then you could potentially drag it across rocks and whatever. And, if you are scraping up, like, even if you don't puncture the hull, which is possible, if you are scratching up and dragging it across rocks and dirt in the ground and so forth, that increases the drag of the canoe and makes it more difficult, makes it more work to move it through the water, because there are little bits and protrusions that are gonna, slow things down. Not necessarily a huge amount, but the amount of work that you would need to put into to get the same whatever Any way that you can increase your efficiency is worthwhile. So canoes would be really something that an adventuring group that is going to potentially be encountering those sorts of obstacles would want to think about bringing. Rowboats, you're likely to see those aren't ones that you are likely to see taken on like an overland expedition where you might need to get across rivers and stuff. But those would be something that would be used in a harbor or around a settlement that might be on a lake or a river or whatnot. Maybe as a small ferry or something like that to go across back and forth. Sailboats, because as we will discuss in a little bit, I'm sure the Tiskrang monopoly on the powered vessels, anybody else and even the Tiskrang use them, when you don't have the need for the larger long distance travel of a riverboat, a sailboat, especially on any of the larger lakes that are part of the Serpent River network, where you have enough area for the wind to pick up and to be able to power a vessel. Sailed vessels are a heck of a lot better than rowed or paddled boats, because at that point you're using wind power rather than muscle power.
Yes, and
that can make a huge difference, especially in terms of how large you can make the vessel and therefore how much you can carry on it.
You're just less tired when you get to your destination if you use wind.
And, when you get to the Aras Sea, which really doesn't feature particularly strongly in, much of the stuff with Barsaive, but when you get to a large inland sea like that, at that point, for any kind of distance stuff, you might use rowed galleys for like bopping around on the coastline, the way that the way that you would have seen with the Greeks and Romans and so forth bopping around the Mediterranean. But you definitely want to get into sailed vessels, if you have the technology, because it's a lot more efficient.
Yeah.
To deal with.
So moving up from the canoe, the rowboat, the sailboat, you get to the sailed Tiskrang fishing boat known as a dreveki.
Yeah, which is basically just a variation on the sailboat. So the same sort of thing. It's just got like the Tiskrang have their own designs for that.
Yeah, but you could at least add that in as some flavor text. If you're on the coast, you should see some dreveki out there catching today's fish.
Yeah.
And bringing and hauling them in, because that's a profession, that's a thing to do, and that feeds the community. So you should include those. So let's get to the fun ones. The canal boats, I thought, was a nice, interesting thing to throw in there. It's about 10 to 15 feet long, 6 to 10 feet wide, depending upon who made it. But this is a pole-steered lake craft, or through canals. So some narrow straits between.
So the floating city in Lake Ban. These are the sort of things, if you think about the iconic gondolas of Venice.
I was going to say the same ones.
Like Venice, like iconic. In a way, the floating city of Lake Ban is modeled a little bit in some regards after Venice, in terms of it being a whole bunch of close together islands. In the case of Venice, they're actually just islands. But in the case of the floating city, they are the tops of these massive underground reed plants that have been cultivated and growing up from the bottom of the lake. But there are basically canals that run between the different little things. And around the city itself, the Tiskrang pole gondolas and barges, small barges basically to get around. So that's the kind of imagery that you're looking there. You might see, the difficulty of a poled vessel, and what I mean by that is that you are powering it rather than, say, a paddle or an oar, where you are
sticking your big long pole down at the bottom.
Yeah, you're basically sticking the pole into the bottom of the river. In the case of the floating city, they're not going all the way down to the bottom of the lake. They're pushing it off of the reeds and plants and stuff that are closer to the surface.
But that is also propulsion and steering at the same time.
Yeah, look up the if you want to do a little bit of research, look up early pictures of the Erie Canal. It was in the United States, 19th century, 1800s, so 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
That basically was a canal that was dug to connect like a river to a particular, like a couple of rivers, or to connect a lake to a river to make transporting goods easier. And
yes,
it was like the canal boats on that were basically like they would have a big pole and they would reach down with a pole and stick it in the bottom of the canal and basically push it along. It is not efficient. A lot of times they would also have them be like they'd have a mule or donkeys or whatever that would be attached to lines off the front of it and that would be walking up the shoreline and basically towing it. But those are the kind of things that you're talking about. They are very, very useful in particular situations when there is very little. Like they don't do well. Obviously, they don't do very well in deep water because it needs to be shallow enough that you can get the pole down.
Yeah. They
also don't do very well because they tend to be flat bottomed boats. Because with a shallow draft, that the draft is referring to how deep below the water's surface the bottom of the boat reaches.
Yeah.
So they tend not to have a particularly deep draft because a lot of times they're being used in shallower water, which makes them very unstable in choppy water. And so they don't tend to get used in areas where there might be a lot of white caps and wake and whatnot and waves from wind or weather. So in the canals of the floating city or in other isolated areas where, you might not, like in maybe larger lagoons or something like that, or some of the deeper tributaries of the Serpent and the Servos jungle and whatnot, where you're not as likely to see a lot of that. And they don't do particularly well in strong currents either, because they're not particularly efficient in terms of the power that you're dealing with.
Yeah. So I would say.
So there, again, something maybe that would feature as something that you would use as a feature for a particular settlement based on how things are set up. Mm-hmm. Any kind of canal boat or barge or something along those lines would be suitable in certain circumstances, as opposed to a canoe, which canoe or a rowboat, which is generally used for sort of transport from point to point, or a sailboat frequently, which is used as a fishing vessel where you can have the wind power it and you like throw your nets or your traps overboard to get those and haul that in and work from there.
So I would say a canoe and a rowboat would probably be a lower target number for a skill or talent roll than a sailboat, because harnessing the wind to get it to go the right direction is probably a lot more complicated in my view. And then the canal boat, I think, would also be slightly somewhere in the middle there, because it's still anybody can grab a pole, I think, and stick it in the water and maybe get where they want to go.
Yeah, the poled vessels would probably be the easiest in terms of the difficulty number, because the idea of just sticking a pole in the bottom of something, I might like either the same difficulty as a canoe or a rowboat, or maybe even a point or two lower, just in terms of the simplicity. But you would get more potential speed and power out of a canoe or rowboat than you would a poled vessel.
Fair enough. So because you mentioned this just a bit ago, onto the dwarven barge, which is dwarves do not take easily to water. And so in Barsaive, trade makes sailors of them all, as the old dwarf adage goes. This is typically a flat-bottom boat that runs close to the river's edge and actually has a team of animals that trudge alongside to pull them upstream, because they do not have any power. There are no oars. There are no sails. This is a big, flat rectangle, and it's carrying stuff. And so it's going to be a lot heavier in the water than just an empty boat.
Yeah,
and
I mean, it's basically a deck that is in the water and loaded down with stuff. If you look at barges are very, very common in the harbors of any major port. Mm-hmm. A lot of times barges, especially if the port, like the places closer up to the shoreline, are not as deep, so they can't take the really deep drafts of larger cargo ships and stuff, they will often have stuff that gets offloaded onto barges and towed in by tugboats into the shore for unloading. But yeah, like the dwarven barges are basically sort of just large, flat bottom, flat top rectangle of of buoyant material that
carries stuff.
The Erie, like I said about the Erie Canal.
Yeah.
You know, the barges that were used on the Erie Canal and other things like that in the 19th century in the United States. Yeah.
So they'll have a small team of pack animals, mules, horses, donkeys, whatever, to pull them alongside. Yeah. And the only thing otherwise is a couple of people are going to be on the shore side, pushing away from the shore to make sure they don't actually run aground.
Yep.
And
again, using poles.
Else. Yeah, that's it. So other than that, there is no locomotion on this whatsoever. So if they're going upstream, the animals pull them. If they're going downstream, they just flow along with the current and as fast as the current wants to take them. And that's pretty much it. So this would be a very cheap way if your adventuring party, I think, is low on cash to get downstream, or if they want to make some cash, they would be the pack animals. I'm just kidding. To get them up, to get the whole barge upstream.
Yeah. The issue with a barge is that unlike a canoe or a rowboat, the barge is just from point A to point B on a waterway, and it's usually a river. You don't, because they, if a barge comes to a lake or something along those lines, it needs to go along one shoreline. It doesn't really have the ability to get to cross larger bodies of water like that. And so, you would probably see like a barge rather than say the barge being owned by, now barges are probably owned by merchant companies, but they are typically maybe operated between a couple of places. Like a caravan trail might come in from overland to a particular boarding spot and then like get a barge there to go downriver or upriver or whatever to the next location, perhaps on the other side, that the barge could in another way perhaps double as a ferry across the waterway as well, depending on what the capabilities and stuff are.
Yeah.
But basically the barge is a way to move significant amounts of goods. Again, to get back to the 1800s in the US, a lot of the crossing of the Mississippi River by the westward settlers was done across by barges.
Because the barge could carry the covered wagons and the horses and everything
right,
else.
Exactly. And if they were not loaded properly, they could founder, or if the water was too rough, like I had mentioned earlier, then they could generally run into problems because it's basically a floating platform to carry goods across water. And if it's not balanced, if it's not balanced, if the conditions aren't great. I remember there was, if anybody's familiar with the old, Sierra games, and I think this might have popped up in the Oregon Trail game as well, if we're talking like classic video games. But the Sierra Online, who did the King's Quest and Space Quest and those games, there was they did a sort of historical adventure game called Gold Rush, I think was the actual name of it, which like started off in New York at the beginning, and you get a letter from your brother who had gone out to California and you apparently discovered gold, and you need to figure out,
join them.
Like the part of the adventure is getting from where you are on the East Coast out to where he is in California, following the clues that he gave you to, locate, to not only find him, but to find the mine and eventually find, see if you have the gold there. But like a big part, like the big sort of act two, the middle part of the game, which was the biggest part of the game, you actually had 3 choices of how to get from New York to California. Option number 1 was to go overland, part of which was getting to St. Louis.
Yeah.
And then like basically booking the wagon and getting across. And one of the things that was involved there, I remember this, was you would go out and you would have to check. You needed to set out early enough that you could get to California before winter, but you couldn't set out too early because the river would be too dangerous because of the snow melt from the from up in Minnesota and Wisconsin
yeah.
and stuff like that, making the river more dangerous. You also didn't want to, you had to make sure, there was a whole bunch of stuff that you kind of, you needed to go out and, you had to wait there a few days, and you needed to go out and check the river every day for the RNG. And if you picked the wrong day, the river would sweep your wagon and stuff off. But the other two, which are not really as relevant to this, were either taking a sailboat down all the way down around the Cape of Cape Horn.
Wow.
Off of, off the tip of South America and all the way up, the other side. Or option number 3 was only having to go down to Panama, but because the Panama Canal had not been built yet, you then had to basically trek across the Panamanian jungle and pick up a boat on the other side to head up. But I remember the overland part of that, and the sort of at least vaguely what the hazards that you could, much like the Oregon Trail game, which was a big part of life of so many grade school kids in the 1980s. You
still got to cross water somewhere, and in Barsaive, you still got to cross some water somehow.
Yeah, you're gonna have to cross some water somewhere somehow. But yeah.
So to your point,
barges.
Yes, the canal boat was one thing. The dwarven barge is another thing. Then there's the river ferry, which you just kind of brought up a minute or so ago. There's a small, older riverboats no longer reliable enough to make journeys of any considerable distance. And there's one that they use in the movie A Knight's Tale, which I will rave about again, where they're literally crossing, but there's a chain connected to each end, to each shore, that strings through the boat so it doesn't get off track. And somebody's making sure that feeds properly, but it doesn't go very fast.
When you are dealing with more traditional style ferries, that was what was often done in the real world, where you often had barges basically that were attached to a chain or heavy rope that was run across from shore to shore. Yeah. You would still need to pole or paddle or whatever you were doing to get the barge to the other side. And sometimes they would actually have it rigged up like a sort of clothesline type thing, where animals or people power on one shore or the other would crank a winch that would kind of spool out from one side and come up on the other, and it would kind of roll along that way. But it would be attached to a line, because obviously if you've got a river, there's a current that's going, and otherwise you would end up drifting downstream, and it's difficult to, you'd be kind of zigzagging back and forth across the river rather than having anchored. The river ferries that they're talking about here in this, because it does mention that they're smaller, older riverboats, which is to say they're not ones that are necessarily used so much for the long merchant trips of the Tiskrang up and down the Serpent River, but they are still powered. And so they probably don't have that same issue. And there are probably a bunch, in addition to sailboats that are ferries, again, talking about the floating city in Lake Ban, there are a bunch of ferries that are running back and forth between various parts of the shore of Lake Ban and the city itself. Both sailboats and these river ferries, which are smaller, older, maybe slightly past their prime riverboats. But, those do not run into the issues that the older, that barge style ferries that you might see on tributaries and whatnot that you're going to run into. I mean, Lake Ban is huge. They're not going to be running ropes or chains or anything like that from the shore to the city.
Yeah. But this is always a good place to work in like an NPC, because somebody's got to be in charge of that boat, or 2 or 3 people who are in that community to take care of that. So if you don't want to maybe necessarily focus on the boat itself or the travel across from one to the other and any hazards that might be along the way, but maybe include an NPC to talk to. This person has talked to 1,000 people. Yeah, like
if you're trying to somebody, if you're trying to pursue or follow somebody or figure out where somebody went, the ferryman at the town, that would be the only way, unless there's a ford, which is basically a place where you can cross without needing a boat, at a river or something like that. The ferryman would be the one who would know and at least have seen all of the travelers going back and forth across the river. In much the same way that you might go to the tavern to get information on travelers, you go when you talk to the ferry operator. Yeah. And see, oh, hey, did you see this person or this group or whatever go through? And and also because they would deal with a lot of travelers, they would be a good source of rumors or news or things like that, because they would be talking to people as they made their way back and forth across the river.
Yeah.
A ferry plays a minor but somewhat important role in the early part of The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
When the hobbits are sort of leaving the Shire there initially early on. There's the ferry that they take across the Brandywine, I think is the name of the river, that they narrowly avoid getting captured by one of the Nazgul because the Nazgul can't cross running water or something along those lines. That's something that happens in both the book and the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can look to that, especially in the book. I think there's a little bit of a better description of how the ferry operates there and whatnot. So it is, definitely
classic fantasy.
Yeah, classic fantasy, and a place that could be perhaps served good to provide information or track people down, that sort of thing.
And all of these, you may have to buy a canoe from somebody. You may have to borrow a rowboat or a sailboat if you're going to be going from one place to the next on a lake. And even the Draveki, all of these are possibilities to throw in other NPCs. So don't discount the fact that just transportation is one thing. Somebody owns this. Somebody has to maintain this, and somebody has to maybe repair this stuff as well. So on to one of the more interesting things I found in the delve was the Scavian barge. I had to go look up where the Scavians were again, and they operate mostly out of the mist swamps.
Yeah, near the mist swamps. The Scavians are a human cultural group.
Yeah.
That according to legends, their city, their homeland is very near what is currently the mist swamps. And they are a water, sort of a nautical folk, a water people, and they have frequently come into conflict with the Tiskrang, and frequently come out on the worse end of that because of the Tiskrang's superior, waterborne technology with the riverboats. But the Scavians have basically massive, they have massive barges, which are really sort of a collection of multiple barges that form basically floating waterborne villages that kind of ply mainly the lower southern reaches of the Serpent River and the Tylan River, which is the tributary of the Serpent there off the south reach that heads up to Daichi and Kratos. Yeah. And they probably also operate on the river that runs near Travar, whose name now escapes me off the top of my head. But
I had it a minute ago. Go ahead.
But so in that area, and they are, they are a kind of, they've got a little bit of influence from the Roma people in terms of being, travelers and whatnot. They're not fantasy versions of that, but there's a little bit of that flavor to them. But they, generally don't get along with the Tiskrang, especially where a lot of their interactions are with House Contention.
The Byros River.
The Byros, okay. But their barges, they have barges, but they are very large, very much more elaborate and complex barge systems. I want to say that there is a fantasy setting, like a novel setting or something, that has a barge dwelling river people that figures in them in some not insignificant fashion, and I am blanking on what it came from offhand.
Well, I watched season 1 of The Golden Compass and on HBO, and that actually has a lot of barge / sailing.
That must be what I'm thinking of, because I've read that series.
Yes. So that was them that I saw recently. I was just going to mention them.
Yeah, I read the books. I watched the original Golden Compass movie that was released many years ago.
Yes,
I have not had a chance to watch the recent series with Lin-Manuel Miranda. I have it on DVD.
It is good.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. HBO does not skimp on their production values, and it's a book that I think would have been better, much better suited to a series than a single novel. Plus, it's got the armored polar bears. So
yeah, come on,
freaking battle bears. Anyway, But yeah, I think like now that you mention that, that's probably what I am thinking of. And there are some very strong similarities between the Scavians and the barge people, whatever they're called in that
I forget
series.
Yeah, it's a thing that they call themselves. And I forget what that is because my memory is usually horrible.
That's okay.
I used it recently. So only a couple left. Now we're getting to the larger powered riverboats that are basically, five decks. The lower deck is usually keelless, which means when you have two sides of a boat that meet and they need to be joined, that is a keel. And so the Viking ships you'll see in the TV show Vikings are keeled because they have a left side and a right side that meet. So a keelless boat does not have that.
Any of the Age of Sail type vessels that you think of like Master and Commander, the clipper ships, the whaling vessels, and so forth. Any of the large multi-masted schooners and stuff like that you would see from the like 15th century on up until like actual, steam power comes into vogue in the late 19th century. All of those are almost universally keeled vessels. The reason for that being is that if you have where it sort of comes down into a point and you've got that keel, that long, massive chunk of wood that runs along the bottom of it, that actually stabilizes the vessel laterally from side to side in the water. Which is definitely something that you want to have if you are going to be out on large open water.
Totally.
For smaller sailboats, if anybody, if you've ever seen pictures of smaller sailboats like Sunfish or Sailfish or things like that, instead of a keel, a lot of what those have is a centerboard, which is a very similar thing. It extends further out, but that does a very similar kind of thing. But any kind of boat that you've got where the bottom kind of comes down to a point, to a greater or lesser degree, is a keeled vessel, and that's for stability.
Yeah. So
it just requires a little bit more advanced crafting technology than a barge, which is basically just strap a bunch of logs together and
flat bottom, make it buoyant. So the lower deck is usually keelless, and that's where they keep all their supplies. The upper deck from that is basically at water level, and that's where they have the heavy cargo, the gangplanks to load the ship, and that's where the fire engine is. The middle deck...
because you want the heavy stuff, if at all possible, to be down below the water line, because that lowers the center of gravity and makes the vessel even more stable.
Exactly. Your middle deck is where you have your medium-sized cargo and your crew quarters. Then your upper deck, or not quite top deck, is your lighter cargo, of course, and that's where you have your fire cannons so that they can actually fire maybe occasionally downward towards somebody else. And then you have the aft castle, which is the very, very top. It's usually the captain's command post and with the rudder and engine control up there. So that's the basic design of the ships. But you have the merchant riverboat, which is, and I couldn't believe the size scale on this, and then I realized that the Mississippi is a river that if you're on one side, you cannot see the other side of.
In some parts of it, yeah.
In some parts of it. So the big places of it, so the merchant riverboat is about 50 to 70 yards long, so half a football field long, and 30 to 40 yards wide. So that is a big vessel to move around. And, by the way, your fire cannons are not on swivels. Those things don't move. So you have to aim your ship to shoot your fire cannons. There's no oars. There's no sails. These are paddle boats. They are noisy. My game master, one of my best friends, grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's been around paddle boats for the first 20 years of his life. And if you are on that sucker, you cannot hear yourself talk. They are very loud near the paddles, and because that's slapping the water continuously. And then the chugging of the engine to make that thing go. If you're at the front of the ship, you have a chance to hear yourself. If you're at the back of the ship, your noise level is completely different. So if you're going to run that...
as a point of comparison, if the sizes of those seemed larger, as an example, I just pulled up the numbers here on Mississippi riverboats.
Yeah.
Which are very clearly the inspiration for the Discrang riverboats. The one that I pulled up here is the Mississippi Queen. This is from Wikipedia. This is the second largest paddle wheel driven river steamboat ever built. Mm-hmm. It is 116 meters long. So a meter is about a yard.
Yeah.
It's actually a little bit, it's 382 feet long. Ooh. So you're talking about, that's 130 yards It's 68 feet wide. So these are big vessels.
Yeah.
And it displaces 3,300 tons, which is to say that's the amount that's how much.
That's what it weighs. Yeah. That's a big ship.
And that's the biggest one. Obviously, there are ones that are smaller than that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, for comparison, so the merchant riverboats that the Tiskrang are operating up and down the rivers all over the place, all have fire engines, all have paddle wheels, and they're about not quite the size of the Mississippi Queen, but smaller than that. And then of course you have the river warship, and then the river galleys. All of those, of course, are in that same category of being, large. The warship, I think, there's sometimes as long as 300 feet. Warships also carry more fire cannons, armor, and crew. The merchant vessels, of course, because they're a freaking warship. And, the crew size on this one, I think, is, 150 Tiskrang or 150 crewmen, boatmen on a warship. So you're talking about a small invading force. So you better come with your A game.
I mean, the Tiskrang riverboats are a large part of why the Tiskrang are so dominant on the Serpent River system.
Mm-hmm.
It is a massive, massive technological advantage when you have enough power that you can have ships of that size. Basically, the Tiskrang riverboats dwarf anything else on the water. Like in terms of size, maybe the Scavian barge villages might come close in terms of area or how many people might be on them. But those are just massive floating platforms. They don't have a whole lot in terms of power. And consequently, that means that other vessels, sailboats, but especially riverboats and so forth, can basically do circles around them.
Mm-hmm.
But the technological advantage that the riverboats provide are why the Tiskrang are the dominant force on the Serpent River.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for inspiration on that, look up Mississippi riverboats. You probably want to see if you can track down some Mark Twain worked as a riverboat pilot.
Yes.
Famous author Mark Twain worked as a riverboat pilot, and there's a bunch of his writings that relate to his work on that. His pen name, Mark Twain, actually comes from riverboat related stuff.
I was just going to say the same thing. It was
the riverboat, the Mississippi riverboat culture of the 19th century, of the 19th century U.S. I mean, riverboats obviously appear in other parts of the world. They are used in Europe and things like that. But I think a big part of the influence of the Tiskrang riverboats is largely taken from that 19th century Americana of the Mississippi River. You also see it appear in Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
The ship that Poirot and the other characters in that are on is a riverboat that is on the Nile.
Which is
very
a new
similar
movie coming out,
kind of situation. There is a new version of that with the Kenneth Branagh doing that. But yeah, check out that like 19th century riverboat situation.
So how would we exactly, we just talked about, like I said, the merchant riverboat and then the warship and the galley. Yeah, this is where you could find a whole lot of ideas as to where to put your adventuring group if game master.
If your group is going to be traveling, if your group is looking to travel a notable distance, and for whatever reason an airship isn't available, and we're probably not actually going to get to airships tonight, but that's fine. We ended up talking a lot more about riverboats, which I think is about water vessels, which I think is fine because they don't get the attention that quite as frequently that airships do. But if you're going to be having any kind of long distance travel from point to point in Barsaive, it behooves the group to look at, is there a way to cover any of that distance along the Serpent River network?
Oh, yeah.
Even if it maybe takes you a little bit out of your way, in a sense.
Faster.
It's faster, and also the Serpent River as a large navigable river, similar to the Mississippi River network or the Nile or any of the river networks in Europe or whatever, people live alongside rivers and lakes and sources of water because for multiple reasons, but that's where things crop up. And so you are not going to potentially run into the isolation that you would out in the plains, where you might go days without encountering a settlement. Along the river, you are going to have even small villages show up periodically, especially with the Tiskrang domination of it and the riverboats running up and down. There are going to be spots pretty frequently to be able to load and unload supplies and all of that sort of thing. So at that point, merchant riverboats they're also certainly a lot easier to deal with because they're a lot less rare than airships should be. The problem, one of the advantages of riverboat travel as opposed to airship travel, airships in most cases are unlikely to going to want to kind of stop and just drop you off anywhere.
Yeah.
They're typically going to be going from like major location to major location, or at least to locations that have the capacity to have airship docks or whatever.
Yeah, I think of them like 747s. They're not just going to be able to stop at a moment's notice.
So they're likely to go from like between major population centers, you know, and so there is a little bit of a flexibility in terms of them because obviously they can pretty much go straight line from place to place. But the river kind of, in one sense, gets reasonably close to a lot of places in Barsaive.
Yes.
And the riverboats are a lot more numerous and a lot less expensive, and certainly faster than walking.
Yes. You don't have to make an appointment for them as much either because they're more ubiquitous all over.
Yeah, and compared to airships, riverboats have a greater capacity to take cargo and passengers.
Mm-hmm.
Until you get up into the larger, like, Theron flying castle stuff, airships, even the larger galleons and whatnot, tend to not have the capacity that the Tiskrang riverboats do.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, you know, and at that point, again, looking at the riverboat as a floating location, I mean, we just mentioned Death on the Nile. You've got an entire novel, basically, a whole mystery that takes place as a ship is traveling, as a riverboat is traveling from point A to point B.
Yeah.
So you can have adventures that are kind of based on and around the riverboat. You've got the interaction, depending on where you're traveling, between the different Tiskrang houses that could potentially cause conflict, while there is the treaty that allows them all to use the Serpent River itself equally. That is not always honored quite as nicely, especially if you are dealing with pirates, or you are up in maybe the North Reach, where House Ishkarat is a lot less likely to honor those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
But you can have colorful characters and encounters. Again, the riverboats are large. They've got a lot of people on them.
Other passengers.
And
the crew.
Other passengers. And of course, then, depending on where you're traveling, you could run into pirates or other waterborne dangers, aquatic horrors, or any sorts of things where perhaps something might attack the ship, and the player characters could come to
cross the river in Barges Passage or something along those lines.
Probably, yeah, that would be more likely in some of the smaller tributaries. You're probably not going to find a tree that's going to be causing that kind of problem on the Serpent.
You never know.
But
it is a fantastical place.
So, those are the sorts of things that you can deal with, and maybe have, a problem that crops up in one of the settlements that the ship is stopping at, that the group might need to investigate or deal with.
Yeah.
One of the things that you can do, even if your group, especially when it comes to water vessels, because groups are a lot less likely to want their own riverboat unless you've got like all Tiskrang, heavily focused Tiskrang game.
Mm-hmm.
Groups are not going to want a riverboat the same way that groups tend to want an airship. And so what you can do is have going back to like recurring NPCs and having the same riverboat cropping up, and so forth when sort of convenient. If you've got an independent captain like the West Thralls,
mm-hmm.
and whatnot, again, depending on what's going on, you can certainly use that as a thing. It's part of their Patreon exclusive stuff, but the folks who do the Crit Show are doing a show right now called Perilous Tides, which is a pirate themed game that's set in a sort of fantasy archipelago setting, and so it's all pirate ships and stuff like that. It's a fantastic show. And if you like high production value actual play podcasts, it is well worth the money to toss their way to get access to that. There's like 40 something episodes of that show that are available now with more to come. It uses a I don't remember the name of it. It's a powered by the apocalypse system. Scallywags? No, I don't remember now what it's called off the top of my head, but anyway,
fair.
And then look at the piracy. I mean, Pirates of the Caribbean. Take or leave the later movies. Pirates of the Caribbean, like that whole kind of like piracy. You can draw a lot of stuff on that for adapt it to the Tiscrang riverboat culture. Especially the independent captains and whatnot. Yeah. There's a whole lot of really cool inspiration that you can draw and get some ideas of how to have adventures and stories that incorporate, even without an actual system to say deal with ship-to-ship combat.
Yeah.
If you handle like that scale of things narratively and figure out how you can get your player characters involved in what's going on, there is a wealth of stuff out there that you can draw from for inspiration as far as adventures and story ideas and personalities and all that sort of thing.
Black Sails, I think was
Black Sails. Yep. There's another one. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which is a big video game that revolves around piracy in the Caribbean and so forth. Treasure Island, or even better, Muppet Treasure Island.
The best version.
There is plenty of stuff that you can draw from to incorporate that. And, again, if your group, unless they've got access to an airship, if your group is going to be doing any kind of extensive travel across or around Barsaive, they are going to need to contend with the Serpent River or its tributaries to some extent at some point.
Yeah.
And it's a good idea to have some ideas about what you might do to spice that up or make it interesting, or an obstacle that they might need to overcome as they get from point A to point B.
And on the bigger ships, you're going to have the possibility of having not only a taverns full of personalities to deal with, because you've got the crew and other passengers and so forth. You also are going to have the opportunity, because it's a very confined space, to have them interact at mealtime, maybe some entertainment time, chip in for contests to keep everybody's skills sharp, maybe contests with the crew, or games of chance, things like that. Or, maybe you want to be the entertainment. Maybe you are the troubadour and you want to go tell the tale and sing the song and so forth and so on. And so lots of possibilities on the bigger ships to have the characters there completely interact with all of the NPCs you've created or want to steal from. And so, yeah, river travel should not be overlooked in Earthdawn. It should be a nice inclusive part of anybody's campaign.
Especially if you think the Tiscrang are awesome, which they are.
Yes, they are. And we will not hear anything contradicting that, by the way. Not hear any arguments on that one. Yeah, we did not get to the airships. We'll make that part 2 some other time.
Yeah, we'll do an airship focused episode, kind of talking about the different airships and the things that you can do, because there are some similarities in how you might handle those with regard to your adventure. The waterborne vessels are, while perhaps the Tiscrang riverboats and so forth are kind of anachronistic. Mm-hmm. You're talking about sort of magic tech things, and then that's one of the things that makes the Tiscrang awesome and iconic in Earthdawn. And that's fine and that's awesome. But waterborne travel and the interactions of that are something that are a lot more familiar and has a lot more historical precedent for drawing ideas and inspiration from. Mm-hmm. And I think, obviously everybody has their own taste, but if you don't every so often look at what you can do to make water travel and all of the different things that are associated with it interesting, I think you're missing out.
Exactly. So we hope that this has inspired either the players listening or the game masters listening to
maybe dip your toes into the river, to perhaps get your feet wet.
And kind of explore, not just metaphorically, explore the use of more water travel in your campaigns and forevermore in the rest of your Barsaive. If you have any questions or any other suggestions that we may have glossed over in the hour we've been chatting, feel free to contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Any final thoughts, Josh? You actually live nearer the water than I do.
Yeah. Well, I grew up, around, we've got a family place on a lake in Maine. And so I grew up around canoes and kayaks and sailboats, and I live not too far from the gorgeous rocky Maine coast of the down, what's called the down east coast, because you go down and east to get to it. Acadia National Park, which is on Mount Desert Island just off the coast of Maine, is, like about an hour's drive from where I live. And while I do not get down there anywhere near as much as I would like, I absolutely love our coast and the ocean and the water and things like that.
Yeah, I married a mermaid, so she takes me to the water as often as she possibly can. So otherwise, folks, it is time for you to go set sail on your own legend.
Good night, everybody.